These have been some just really powerful and relevant presentations ahead of this one. I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Lynn Langton. I'm the program director for the Victimization and Response program here at RTI. And I'm going to let my co-presenters introduce themselves. We're doing a hybrid presentation today as well.
Great. Nice to see everybody stuck around. We were a little worried that you were all going to escape out the room as the last presentation of the day. My name is Amy Dural. I am currently employed with the Office for Victims of Crime. I'm a fellow that is focusing solely on law enforcement response to victims. And my connection to this project started, RTI invited me to be a subject matter expert that helped them design the tool. And so just somebody with field experience. And so I was really honored to be a part of that process, and then to see it come to fruition has been really great. So I think it'll be a useful thing for law enforcement agencies to kind of grab onto and kind of further their measurement and engagement with victims over time.
And Jacqueline, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Joining you from Denver, Colorado. My name is Jacqueline Houston-Kolnick, and I am a researcher in the program that Lynn leads, so the Victimization and Response program, and I'm really excited to be with you all today.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about a topic that is always a crowd favorite: performance measurement. Before you all leave the room, I'll just start by saying it doesn't necessarily have to be as abstract or complicated as it sounds. And it actually is very much tied in with some of the themes that we were hearing from this morning around things like trust in law enforcement, developing and understanding whether that's been established. And the fact that law enforcement may not always know what the community thinks of them, or they may have perceptions that are not necessarily true. And so performance measurement, and specifically what we're going to be talking about today, starts to get at some of that. And this isn't about, looking at whether departments are doing something wrong. It can also be about whether departments are doing something right. And there's a lot of other benefits as well. And so, all right, just to get started here. So what is performance measurement? You want to click ahead, Jacqueline? So in simple terms, this is just a tool to help departments know whether the programs and services are having their desired results. So are the things that you're doing, the activities that you're doing, effective, essentially? Do you want to jump ahead?
Did it not progress? It's showing it as a screen. Okay.
All right, so there are several different ways that we can measure performance. So the first one that we talk about often is outputs. And this is just trying to measure what it is that we're doing. And we're going to provide some examples of this in just a second. The second one is a little bit more difficult to measure, but still relatively straightforward in concept. And this is measuring the quality. So how well are we doing the things that we're doing? And then the final one, measuring outcomes. This is arguably the most important. And as I alluded to, this is really just getting at, are the things that we're doing actually working? And many departments are already measuring all of these things. What's less common is for the victim perspective to be incorporated into how these things are measured. But Amy's going to talk a little bit about how departments are already going about performance measurement, and then we're going to tie in the victim perspective as well.
Yeah, I think that law enforcement agencies have been measuring things for a long time, right? There have been hard data measurements that have been put into place. That's how they measure their success. That's how they drive funding. That's how they convince people that they're doing their job. One of the more simplistic things to think about is arrests, right? When we think of law enforcement, we think of people being arrested, right? And so when you think of outputs, it's the number of arrests, right? Law enforcement measures the number of arrests. When you think about the quality, you think about, well, did all of the officers follow procedures when they made those arrests? right? That gets to a different level of understanding and a different level of measurement than just the number that happened. And then when it comes to outcomes, it's diving into those numbers to say, did those arrests and the way they performed in their policy implementation, in their procedure implementation, has it affected the arrest rates? Has it affected case closures? Has it affected the overall crime reduction, right? So you kind of see that trajectory. What I have found in the course of my 35-year field career is that there's a lot of measurement in law enforcement on that type of data. What's not so common is the measurement of a parallel experience of victims going through those same processes. So what does it look like for victims when the arrest is made? What does it look like for victims when police do or don't follow their established procedures? What does it look like on the crime rates, on the outputs, on those outcomes, and the victim lens on that, right? Are we taking those into account? And so for me, performance measurement, we have to kind of open that field up a little bit and really understand that it's not just about the hard data, but it's also the victim experiences of police doing their jobs or a direct experience that victims have. And how can we tie those two things potentially to really big outcomes? So how does victim experiences tie into reduction in crime rates, right? How does victim experiences tie into case clearance rates? How do those concepts tie together, and are we measuring them with that lens in mind?
So Amy, you just alluded to this, but why should agencies incorporate victim engagement into performance measurement? That's really what we're going to be talking about. But if you want to jump ahead, Jacqueline, the first question is kind of, what do we even mean when we talk about, sorry, am I on now? Thank you. What do we even mean when we talk about incorporating victim engagement into performance measures? When we talk about measuring the quality of the engagement and the outcomes of the engagement. So from the quality perspective, you can think about this as being a little bit akin to measuring procedural justice, which I think is a concept that most people are pretty familiar with. So just the notion that how we go about doing the things we do can really make a big difference. And with the tool that we're going to be talking about today, this isn't really getting at fairness per se, but some of these other measures of how a victim perceives the engagement to have gone. So did they feel that they were treated with respect? Did they feel like they were supported? Did they feel like they got the answers to some of the questions that they needed to have answered? And then on the outcome side, outcomes are really going to vary depending on the level of engagement that an officer or an agency is having with a victim. So if it's a relatively brief engagement, it's maybe not intended to change a person's life, but maybe it makes that individual feel safer. Maybe it gives that individual some connections to community resources that they may not have had previously. So there are other outcomes that can be achieved even through those kind of short-term engagements. And so that's really what we're talking about here when we're talking about measuring performance around victim engagement.
So, and I think this really blends into the conversation that we've been having all day, right? So you want to measure how you're performing as a law enforcement agency with victims in mind, because most of the time when you're acting as a law enforcement agency, there's a victim component to your work. And so why do you want to measure that? Because what we hear from victims often is a lack of trust. What we hear from victims is it's not a reliable system. It's not a safe and equitable system for them to come to. And so you as a law enforcement agency want to figure out where those gaps are, because those victims are the bread and butter of you making the community safer, right? You want to make sure that you're getting into the areas where maybe there's a trust gap, right? From a victim lens, so that you can understand how to adjust your work, so that you can understand how to adjust your practices to build up that trust. What we know from great research is that it affects how people interact with law enforcement as victims. It affects the likelihood for them to contact law enforcement in the future. So if I, as a victim of a crime, have an experience with law enforcement in trying to report that, and it doesn't go according to my expectations, the chance of me coming back to that law enforcement agency to tell them something else diminishes, right? And that makes the whole community less safe. It doesn't help any of our neighborhoods. It doesn't help any of the overarching picture, right? We also want to measure how we're doing when we engage with victims as law enforcement agencies so that we don't end up adding harm to the process. We come in with good intentions. We're the good guys as law enforcement agencies. We want to take the report. We want to take care of victims, but maybe the way we're going about it actually hurts them. It actually deters them, and that's not our intention, right? So you want to measure what you're doing. You want to get an assessment of what you're doing. I can tell you as a field practitioner, I made huge mistakes because I thought my good intentions predicted the outcome. I thought I came into this wholeheartedly wanting to do the right thing, and I thought I knew the path to get there. And boy, when I started measuring the work of my staff, I was flat wrong, right? And so our good intentions don't always predict what the outcomes will be through a victim lens, right? So making sure you take that into account. That's why you want to do performance measurements, so that you make sure that your assumptions are correct, so that you make sure that your programming is correct, so that you make sure decisions and policies are correct, right? What I will tell you is that I think everybody who works at a law enforcement agencies wants victims to engage with the process. That's how we solve crimes. That's how we find the bad guys. That's how we know that we enhance community safety, is if we keep victims engaged. If we keep them involved, if we keep them coming back to answer our 27th question, right? Because we forgot to ask it the first 3 times we interacted. So why you measure is to figure out why people don't stay engaged with your system. Why don't they? Why do they disengage? Why do they drop out? And so it's really important that you understand the spaces where that happens, the decisions, the policies, the practices that as law enforcement agencies you've instituted that maybe push people away instead of bringing them in, right? And so what we know that information gathered from measurement can really help us show what is and isn't working for victims. It can identify areas of growth, space where we need to do better. But it can also identify spaces where, wow, we did a really good job. I didn't know that resonated with victims in that way. That's the piece that's keeping them engaged, not these 12 other things that we thought we were doing right, right? And so it's really important. It can help shape how you train your personnel, how you develop policies, the way you write things. The people you put in front of victims at certain intersections can all be shaped by measuring. It can all be shaped by taking a look at your own processes.
All right, so the question is, and you would think I could get this mute thing right after months and months of being on Zoom calls, but still can't seem to do that. So the question is, how can agencies find out whether the engagement with victims is working? And the answer is to ask the victims. Simple, right? No, it's not that simple, and we recognize that. It can be quite daunting, in fact. And that's one of the things that I'm going to turn it over to Jacqueline, and she's going to talk about the improved tool that we've developed. This tool was developed with support from the U.S. Department of Justice, several different agencies within the Department of Justice, because they recognize how important it is for agencies, for other practitioners that engage with victims, to start to really measure the quality of the engagement and the outcomes of that engagement. So Jacqueline, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lynn and Amy. So as Lynn mentioned, this is a tool that we have been working on for the past 3.5 years. And now we'll be rolling it out into the field nationwide come late spring, early summer. So there's an opportunity for agencies to use this in measurement. And so we wanted to give you an overview of what this tool is and what it does. and how it could possibly be used to help you understand and ask victims about the outcomes and the quality of the support that they received. So the Improve platform is a web-based tool. So we have a website, you'll see the landing page here, that allows you to create an account and then customize a survey. And Lynn kind of alluded to this. We try and do some pre-made decisions and some ways to make it really simple and easy to use. And so you can then create a customized survey that can be easily used to measure quality and outcomes of engagement with victims. And like Lynn mentioned, it's called the Improve platform. And it's intended to be used by any justice system or community-based victim service provider or organization that really works with and supports victims in the aftermath of crime. That also means that hospitals or tribal campus or other agencies could use this tool. And so it's a really wide swath of groups of people, which include many of you. We went through an extensive process to develop the survey instrument, and it included talking to victims. It included folks like Amy weighing in about what works well for different agencies, what's meaningful for them to measure. And we wanted to make sure that throughout this process, the questions felt relevant both to providers, but also to victims themselves. Do they understand the questions that we're asking? Are they relevant to their experiences? So on and so forth. So really throughout this entire process, we've had a mix of victim voice as well as experts like Amy to understand what things are relevant and important to measure. And that's led us to the Improve platform that exists today. So what is within Improve? We've talked already about kind of what is performance measurement and what are outcomes and quality, but to get a little bit more tangible, outcomes are built within Improve and are able to be customized for an individual provider, but those really measure the extent to which victims' physical, emotional, psychological, social, economical, legal needs, a whole range of needs are met through the services that they received. Now, different programs, right, have different levels of engagement. So we were talking a bit earlier about kind of based off engagement, what do we measure and when? And that's a really important question that we'll have TA around for providers. So your agency might not address all of these needs, but really your survey is customized to the needs that you feel like your program impacts. Then there's that quality of engagement of services. This is really victims' perceptions about how they were treated, whether or not they were heard, the extent to which their needs were identified and responded to. And then victim demographics. Lastly, Improve also collects some demographic information. And this is really critical, so you could potentially explore different types of experiences people may have. Maybe one type feels like really positive about their engagement, and maybe another is saying, man, I needed more. And here's maybe some of those areas that we can address. So that demographics allows you to explore your data in unique ways based off of both survivor characteristics as well as their victimization experiences as well. So a provider goes through, they end up creating a survey. Here's what it looks like from a victim's perspective. We have survey links that are anonymous. And once a victim fills this out, they hit submit and it automatically transmits back to the platform. So if any of you have done satisfaction surveys or surveys of any kind, there is no data entry with this system. And I think that is a huge win. We do offer paper surveys because we know some folks are most comfortable completing it that way. But we do recommend to try and strategize around how to get people these survey links electronically. And those survey links can be shared so many different ways with victims. So we have agencies who text the survey link to survivors. We have them email. Some pull it up on their computer, or they have the victim scan a QR code and they pull it up on their personal device. We also have folks who do tablets. So there's a lot of different ways that someone can fill out this survey, and it can be in your office or it could be once they leave. So there's a lot of ways we've made it hopefully easy for you to administer this to folks. And we are continuing to learn from folks using the platform about the innovative ways that they've gotten this into the hands of victims that they support. Improve itself is free to use. It's available in multiple languages. So the survey instruments are translated, and there's options for English, Spanish, Mandarin, and Vietnamese. It's accessible on any internet-ready device. So you do need to be connected to internet at this time to actually fill out the tool, but it is accessible if someone has that. Their surveys are customizable, so we do have some pre-made decisions on some base outcomes that could be relevant for folks. And then you're able to add additional questions based off of what feels like the best and right fit for what your agency seeks to address. Like I mentioned, automatic data upload. And then there's also a data dashboarding component. And that component allows you to explore your data in real time. So you're able to drop down and look at a variety of characteristics and then understand how are folks responding based off of those specific selections that you've made. So that's a little bit about the improved platform. Next, we wanted to pass it over to Amy to talk a little bit about when should a department or agency use something like Improve.
My vote is that if you are having contact with victims in any way, shape, or form, you should be using this. So when and why is just because you have engagement with victims and you want to do it well and you want to do it right and you want to constantly be looking at how the way you conduct your business impacts them. So for me, it's just a relevant part of making sure that we're all putting our best foot forward, that we're all, doing that constant reassessment of, are we doing the right thing by the people that we profess to serve, right? And so for me, there's no downside to assessing this. What I will say is that sometimes victims get fatigue from people like us, from people like researchers coming in and asking them a lot of invasive questions, and they never see the output from that. So if you're going to do this, be prepared to do something with the information that you receive, right? You owe it to those people to carry through on that. Don't just come into people's lives and ask them a bunch of questions about very vulnerable points and then go, okay, that was really interesting. That was cool, right? Like you need to do something with that and be prepared to change your own processes. Because if that's who you're identifying as serving, then you need to serve them in the way that makes sense to them. So for me, when and why you should do it is just pretty straightforward, but it also takes a responsibility and a commitment to do that. So we're going to talk a little bit about why it's important to think through that. It's not just as straightforward as putting this tool out there for everybody to use, right? I think when we think specifically about law enforcement agencies engaging with victims, that can look wildly different based on the law enforcement agency, right? So we have some small rural jurisdictions where literally they have 15 police officers. Their victim engagement looks very, very different than a large city police department with specialized units and incorporated victim service personnel with full-on response units that go out to scene and handle every victimization type, right? And so you want to be very, very thoughtful when you're using this tool. Are you measuring what you think you're measuring? Are you asking the questions and then taking that information and applying it to every other process that really wasn't measured by the questions you asked, right? So be thoughtful about that. For some, you can use this to measure the quality of a minute engagement, right? So that could be taking a report. What was that like for a victim, right? It can be a very time-limited, very singular part of the process. But if you think about victim engagement with law enforcement, it's much more broad than that. And so are you measuring the spaces where that victim engagement happens, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like and maybe how comprehensively you need to think about that as you step into measuring victim experiences. And really towards the end of it is what we all hope for, right? Is to really measure those outcomes, really to measure those victim experiences in alignment with what we're trying to do. So if you want to flip to the next one, what I will say is that when we talk about victim intersections, with the system, and it looks like it's having trouble catching up. There we go. Um, there's a lot of spaces, and this is not exhaustive, just so you know, but this is just to kind of help you guys think through that there might be multiple places within a law enforcement response where there's victim engagement opportunities and victim service opportunities, right? Depending upon how your agency approaches interactions with victims, some of you may see that as a service to them. Some of you may employ victim service specialists who take on a high level of responsibility for victim response efforts on behalf of your agency. And so figuring out what that looks like, but initial response is a great place to start. I think what we all kind of fall to is that officer out in the field taking a report. The reality is there's a lot of initial response mechanisms where victim engagement is a component of that. There is dispatch, right? That is the first engagement with a victim when it comes to reporting a crime. There are online reporting options with victims attached. There are spaces and jurisdictions where victims are required to come into substations to report certain crimes because they won't dispatch somebody to the field to take that level of a report. So if you only measure reports being taken in the field, you're missing a piece of the victim engagement around initial response, right? So that's the kind of stuff that you need to think about as you're measuring performance. Interviews. We all think of victim interviews as a space, and that's absolutely reliable, but there's also other interviews that occur that affect victim engagement and victim experience. So whenever an investigator interviews a witness, guess what? There's a victim engagement component to that. Same with suspects. There are some communities, some jurisdictions that use controlled communication as an investigative tool. That is absolutely a process that involves victim engagement. And are we measuring that? Is that something that we're thinking about in terms of their overarching experience with our agency? Forensic exams are another space where there's engagement with victims and services provided to victims where it's unique and separate and sometimes seen as not really part of the law enforcement experience. But from a victim lens, I promise you it's part of their experience with law enforcement, right? Case status updates, we think of these often as the law enforcement official providing an update to the victim. Some do it well, some do it not so well. Some forget that the victims exist, right? And victims tell us that all the time. I heard some conversation earlier today about the experience of cold case, right? And one of the things that cold case victims have repeatedly said for years is that they feel forgotten by the system, right? They feel forgotten by the agency that's in charge of investigating this crime on behalf of them and their families. Case status updates for many agencies only happen when they have something to share. Victim lens on that is, I don't care if you have something to share, I want you to stay in touch with me so that I know I'm not forgotten, right? So it serves a different purpose through a victim lens. What I will tell you, working as a victim service provider within law enforcement, is those case updates were valuable for the victim, but they were also incredibly valuable for me to convey updates to the investigative team about how the victim's doing, what has changed in their life since the point of incident, what supports do they have in place now, what is their engagement level, what are their engagement desires, do they want to come in for an interview now where 3 weeks ago that wasn't an option, right? So those case status updates are bi-directional when I'm performing within a law enforcement role, right? Victims engage with law enforcement in spaces that don't traditionally involve people in uniform. So records personnel who process requests for copies of reports. Many victims who apply for crime victim compensation have to supply a copy of a report to somebody, which may require them to come to the police department to ask for it. And those people are not wearing uniforms. Those people are not in traditional service roles the way we characterize those. But I promise you, the victim feels that was part of the overarching response, right? And then certainly if your agency employs victim service personnel, take a look at what they're doing, right? Is it having the desired outcome for serving victims that you think that it is? And if it's not, make adjustments. But this tool, I can't tell you how much I would have enjoyed having this tool available to me when I was a field practitioner in law enforcement, because it would have allowed me to make staffing decisions within my victim services unit. It would have allowed me to make decisions about how I convey information to victims in the most effective way. And at what point on the process are they most receptive to get that information? Maybe it's not 24 hours after the crime occurred. Maybe we adjust that to 72 hours after the crime occurred, and maybe that will affect how well they receive the information. So for me, this is a valuable tool for a victim services administrator to think about how I adjust my specific services. But I can also see where this could be an incredibly valuable tool for law enforcement agencies of any size or any jurisdiction.
All right, so lots of examples there about all of the different points in time that an agency might want to use a tool like this. And then we talked earlier about all of the different reasons that it's important to measure the quality and the outcomes of those different types of victim engagement. But I'm sure there's still folks that are not sold on this. And that's common and normal. And we hear that across all the different components of the victim service field and victim engagement spaces, because there's just a lot of misconceptions out there around satisfaction surveys in general, which is ultimately what we're talking about. So we just wanted to address some of those head on. So, one of the first myths or misconceptions that we often hear around victim satisfaction surveys is that they're not necessary because we already have a good sense of the impact of what we do and how well we do it. And again, this came up earlier in the conversation today around the fact that, our perceptions of how someone perceives us and what we're doing are not always aligned. And I can tell you that we learned about this firsthand when we were doing the testing of this instrument with victims that Jacqueline mentioned earlier. We could talk to practitioners who engage with victims and hear from them what they thought were the most important measures of quality, the most important outcomes for victims. And then we talked to the victims, and the things that practitioners thought were the most important weren't necessarily what the victims thought were the most important. So that just highlights where there can sometimes be this disconnect. And there really is this benefit to hearing firsthand from the victim. And that carries a lot of weight too. It's one thing for a department to say, yeah, no, I think we're doing a really good job with victims. It's another thing to say, here's the data to show that we're doing a really good job with victims. Or, here's where we may need to make some adjustments because we're not doing as well as we would maybe like to be doing. All right, so another misconception or myth is that victims have experienced trauma. And so asking them to complete a survey, especially following a crisis situation, could be re-traumatizing. And this is a hugely important consideration. But a couple things about that. One is, through this process of developing the instrument, one of the things we were really focusing on when we were talking with victims is, are these questions relevant? Would they have caused you distress in the aftermath of your experience? And so we've made sure that, in working through these questions, that you have that victim perspective baked into the process to reduce the potential for re-traumatization. But then the other thing is, it's really important how the opportunity is presented to the victim. And so if it's presented as an opportunity to perhaps make a difference for future victims in terms of, providing feedback that will shape future engagement, research suggests that many individuals actually really appreciate having that opportunity to be able to provide that feedback and potentially have an impact on for future victims. And then, the other thing that's really important is that this type of survey, victim survey, satisfaction survey, should always be voluntary, so that the victim always has the opportunity to say, no thanks, I would prefer not to do that. But it's important that we give the victim the chance to make that decision for themselves about whether or not they want to provide this feedback or that, they want to do that. We shouldn't be making it for them just by assuming that they wouldn't want to do that. All right, so the third myth or misconception is that victim surveys are time consuming and that the only people who are going to fill them out are those that have really negative feedback to provide. So a couple things here. I mean, first of all, these surveys don't have to be lengthy to provide really important information. And so we've developed these surveys to be, 3 to 5 minutes. So they're pretty brief. We don't want to be burdensome. And again, it's really important, I think, the way that the survey is presented to victims. And if it's presented as a tool for improving services, they'll likely participate. And Amy alluded to, where we see victims getting frustrated is if they don't think that the feedback they're providing is actually going to be heard or that anything's going to be done about it. So that's another important part of how this opportunity is conveyed. And then just in general, I mean, research suggests that most victims do feel really satisfied with their engagement with law enforcement. Community perceptions of law enforcement are generally high. And so it's important to know that going in, that it's not necessarily just those individuals that feel frustrated or had a negative experience that are going to be filling this out. We've seen that play out, that that's not the case, but it is important to hear from those who have had a negative experience and to understand what it was about that experience. And then, jump ahead, Jacqueline. So then the last myth is that, and I think this one is really important, is that even if agencies have the time or resources to collect these data, they don't necessarily have the ability to actually use the data. And you were alluding to that quite a bit, and that's something that we want to talk through with technical assistance and really helping to take these findings and turn them into more practical, applied information about what an agency can do with them. But we also have tools baked into the platform. Jacqueline alluded to the dashboard. Do you want to jump ahead one slide, Jacqueline? So we also have tools that just can help to see, really clearly and simply the distributions of responses across the questions. Now, again, what to do with this information is another question, but in terms of, being able to analyze the data, we're trying to make that as easy as possible so that an agency using this platform just could go to their dashboard. There's a number of different filters there. So you could filter by date, for example. So if you want to know if, this past year has been better than the prior year in terms of the distribution of responses, are you actually seeing improvements in the distribution of responses? You could use that filter. And then there's also filters by, respondent characteristics, demographic characteristics, the type of crime that a victim experienced. And then also, I think a really important thing that we've been alluding to all along is around the duration and the frequency of their engagement. So actually being able to parse that out on this dashboard so that you can see that if it's a victim that had a very brief engagement, what did the distributions of some of their perceptions of the quality of that engagement look like compared to someone that was engaged with the department for a much longer period of time. Next slide. So we did an extensive pilot test of this platform with about 200 law enforcement agencies. And we have learned some really important lessons from that. And we've learned that even though we've tried to make this easy, there are still some challenges. But those are all things that we're working to address. And I'm going to turn it back to Jacqueline to talk a little bit about what we learned from that and how that process worked.
Yes, we learned a lot. So there are a handful of law enforcement agencies actually that helped us pilot this platform. So we pilot tested it from October 1st to December 31st of 2022. So 1 quarter or reporting period for many folks. And we had about 200 agencies testing the platform. They ranged from victim witness assistance programs, law enforcement-based victim services, domestic violence, sexual assault providers, CACs, a whole gamut. We had a lot of different folks testing the platform. Throughout, we had a help desk, and that help desk will continue to move forward. So we were tracking what issues people had, the difficulties that they encountered. And then since then, we've done both a survey and focus groups to learn more about people's experiences. And a few things that we just wanted to highlight for you all and from agencies that we spoke with, and specifically our justice-based providers, was one, a need to really get some more TA and training and technical assistance around the technology of the platform itself, navigating it and using it, and navigating, ensuring that their firewalls, right, don't kick them out from accessing it. And so there are some of those more technological pieces that we're strategizing around now and plan to have more content and support around in the future. We also heard from agencies about some difficulties with figuring out when's the right time to administer this tool. How do I provide it to folks in a way where there's enough time for them to respond, or there's been enough time for this to have an impact? And that's also, again, more TA that we want to have around it. And then another one that's really something that I think we'll continue to talk about over time is the difference between, the potential for a law enforcement-based victim service provider versus the entire engagement in the criminal justice system. And we know that, right, system outcomes are sometimes beyond our control to change and impact, but those can sometimes impact victims' feelings about their experiences. And so one way that we've tried to mitigate this and probably needed a little bit more front-end messaging on is that every question in Improve has the support I received from name of agency. And so, there might be some ways in which we need to strategize around how do you identify the specific program or type of support that you want feedback on, and differentiate that from, the broader criminal justice system engagement. So those were just a few of the things that we heard from folks in the pilot test. We are taking a step back in this kind of interim period and doing bulking up our training and technical assistance, making some tweaks to the platform to just ensure that there's clarity and ease of use. And then we're looking to launch it, Improve 2.0, as we lovingly call it internally, in late spring, early summer of 2023. So in the near future. And I was navigating some questions in the chat. You're able to go to the website and see it. We just ask that you don't register for the platform because we won't approve you just because we're in a downtime. But I put in the chat, and we'll have up on the screen in a minute a QR code where you can indicate your interest in more information once Improve is live. So that will be an opportunity just to stay in the loop with us. And you can decide whether or not you participate at that point, but this is just if you want to be engaged. And one other question that I just wanted to answer real quick that we got was, where is the data stored and how long is it kept? Great question. The data is stored on, RTI has some servers that we store the data on, and it's kept for the duration of your use in the platform. You are always welcome to, if you want to download that data and take it off, you can. There's lots of different ways, but basically it's stored with us and it's kept for however long you're using the platform. And yeah, that's about it. Other than that, we're on to our Q&A.
Well, and Jacqueline, let me just jump in on that last point too. So we should have mentioned that everyone using the platform, every provider has their own individual login information. It's an account that only that agency or department can access. And I think another really important thing to note is that the survey itself, the satisfaction survey, doesn't collect any personally identifiable information from a victim. So the data are stored on the platform, but there's nothing that's identifiable or could be tied back to an individual. And we've also put some protections in place with the dashboarding, for example, to suppress findings when there are only a few survey responses for that exact reason, so that an individual's response can't be identified within the data or by the agency or department at all. So that's an important thing to mention. And yeah, I think we're going to do some Q&A, and then if we have time, we can actually even do a little demonstration of the platform itself if anyone's interested in that. But are there any questions?
One thing I'll offer to people is don't get so daunted that this doesn't have to be a cumbersome process, right? You can have some front end conversations and decide what you want to measure. And listen, there's some customizable, the questions in there are really easily customizable, meaning that there's some predetermined set of questions that if that's all you want to start with those, right? But it doesn't have to be daunting, and it doesn't have to be something that is burdensome for your staff. I was just thinking as I heard these presentations earlier this morning, if you have community policing, if you have people that's their sole job, that's a great mechanism to push out this kind of survey, right? It doesn't have to be by the service providers themselves. And sometimes I would recommend that it not be, right? When I was an administrator in a prior agency doing this kind of work, it always felt a bit awkward for me to have myself or my staff say, we've done all this work on your behalf. Now, can you tell us how we did, right? It feels not appropriate, right? And so is there a way for you to do this? You can put it up on your agency website. You can send it out in community newsletters. You can have flyers sitting in the front lobby of your substations to where it can be something that people pick up just in the normal course of business. And it's not a burden that gets placed on officers to go around and hand a survey to every victim that they interact with, right? Because we all know that they have a ton of stuff to do already. And so there are just easy ways to have this incorporated into your normal processes that you might find some interest from victims who see this posted somewhere and say, oh, you know what, I would like to provide some input about that experience that I had. And that might be useful to you as you make decisions moving forward. Is it?
There we go. Amy, you started talking about this. So if you could just expand, or one of the other panelists, you mentioned the appropriateness of like implementing the survey or giving it out. Is there any guidance or best practices that you all offer about who should be giving the survey, how you should be giving it, and like when?
Yeah, so I think those are really important questions, right? I think anytime we tap into victims, we want to make sure that we're taking, care with that ask, right? I mean, to me, that's they're just the only participant in this messed up system that didn't ask to be there. And so for me, we just have a level of responsibility to them that we don't have for all the other players. So it's important, right, that you get it right. But I think what you're going to see with the team here at RTI is that's what they're talking about, is providing some additional TA around those questions, because from the rollout, from those field experiences, from people who've tested the system and tested the platform, they've gotten some feedback back that maybe some additional guidance does need to be provided, and that's really useful to use. I know that when I was doing field work, I worked for a couple of different law enforcement agencies, and that looked wildly different in both of those agencies. And so how I would have used this tool would have looked different for each agency that I worked for. And so I think that some of that is on RTI to provide some guidance around, but some of that is also just the responsibility of the agency themselves to be having honest and thorough conversations and responsible conversations about what they're measuring and who's going to be involved in that and what does that look like and what are our expectations from that. And the TA that RTI provides is going to help with that.
Yeah, and we have a number of different resources that we've developed already to provide some of that guidance and guidance around things like, I mean, in terms of measuring outcomes, right? There are going to be some engagements where, again, it's just too brief. It may not have any intended, it may not be intended to have any longer term outcomes. And so then that's where measuring the quality of that engagement can be really important, right? So we do provide guidance around that. Another, important piece of guidance is, especially with other victim service providers, like they'll try to administer a survey as the person is walking in the door. Well, they haven't gotten services. They haven't had any experience that would have any outcomes. So that's also not the point in time to measure outcomes, right? It has to be after some sort of substantial engagement. So we do have resources and tools, and like Amy was saying, and Jacqueline too, that's part of the next stage of the project, and the rollout is even to develop additional training and technical assistance based on what we learned from the pilot test, and then based on what we hear in terms of questions from any practitioners using the site through the help desk and other vehicles.
And something we weren't explicit about that Lynn kind of just alluded to is there's a survey that has both outcome and quality. And then every survey also has just the quality only option. So there's different links. So if you have a shorter term engagement with someone and maybe you're like, I don't know if they're going to come and engage in those other additional services, you could give them the quality only survey and learn just about that, a brief engagement. And so the platform has that ability to give you one of the two links that you can decide as a provider which one is most appropriate and when. We have an online question. You want to take the one in the room?
No, you go ahead, Jacqueline.
Okay, great. So Gabrielle O'Keefe said, or Gabrielle, this is an interesting tool. Great job on the delayed lit review. Did you use grounded theory for initial analysis of interviews? And I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more on the future development and improvement of the survey. Item wording, generating new items is relevant to the type of agency, etc.
You want to start, Jacqueline?
I know. I was like, I don't know who's going to jump in. So for the interviews, we didn't necessarily take a grounded theory approach. We did a handful of interviews and then took extensive notes and kind of pulled up those high level themes. And in cognitive interviews, you really take detailed notes about people's understanding and then adjust and then retest. So we still had systematic processes, but it wasn't necessarily theory driven in that same way. And then we are going to be making some developments both to the platform and exploring some to the tool. We've heard from folks around new items that they might be interested in exploring, or ones that we might consider adding to the pool of options. And so we're looking at both in general, what are pre-programmed options that we make available. And then we're also looking at, sometimes people have funder required questions. So how do we potentially integrate some of that into the platform, which would be possibly a future iteration that we're looking towards. But that's another area that we are exploring. So we are continuing to refine the tool as time goes on. Anything to add, Lynn or Amy?
Amy, you mentioned agencies might put it on their website or send out in a newsletter. Is there any concern of someone like trying to mess with an agency taking a survey even though they weren't a victim? Is that something that ever came up?
I don't know that that's a specific concern. I mean, I guess somebody could always self-identify as a victim, right? And that can happen with any survey that's provided. That can happen with the NCVS survey, right? Like that can happen in any way. I think the questions and the way that they're posed and the way that they're phrased, you would have a difficult time getting through those if you didn't have an experience. And so it's not a high concern for me. I would consider that the information is being provided by people who have actually had a victimization experience. And so for me, that's valuable information. There's always a risk when you're asking people for anonymous information, but the risk for me is much higher when you ask people to identify who they are and ask people for their personally identifying information, because then you just don't get the information that you need. And so I think it's a well-crafted tool. I think a lot of thought was put into how the questions were worded. They held listening sessions and intentional, work-driven conversations with not just myself, but experienced personnel from multiple fields that provide services to victims. And so they got a pretty well-rounded thought process in terms of people, pushing information back to them for how to craft the tool itself. So I'm not super concerned about that particular aspect. And I think anybody who takes the survey as a victim, once they get past question 2, and if they didn't have a victimization experience, they just wouldn't know how to answer the questions. So.
Thank you.
Well, and I think the other thing is that through the platform, an agency or department has access to the raw data, and I'd have to double check, but I think that it's some kind of measure of like IP address, even if it's, I think there's some kind of measure there where you could probably see if the same person is filling out a survey over and over again in a very short period of time, it's probably something that could be identified, and then that would be a quick thing that we could certainly take care of on the back end if there was a situation like that. A question at the back of the room. Oh, Mark. Okay, sorry. And then Mike.
This is really exciting. In the pilot work you've done, or has it come up? Have y'all thought about benchmarking or allowing agencies to see some aggregate and do comparisons?
So that's actually a component of phase 2. And that's one of the things that we're planning to develop through this implementation project is a larger website. Now, agencies would have to agree that they wanted their data to be included in that, but then to have filters that would allow any kind of practitioner to filter based on intended outcomes, based on type of victim, based on whether they're a law enforcement agency or some other type of service provider, and then to be able to see those responses and how those distributions compare. Yep, that's exactly part of what we're going to be doing. So thank you for that question.
Same.
We have a question online. Oh, I can't see the room, sorry.
Go ahead,
Do you want me to
Jacqueline.
jump in?
Yeah.
Okay, so Ruth Thatcher was asking, for domestic violence victims, how do you direct them to a safe way to participate without risk of their abuser seeing a record of the site in their browser history on a monitored device? Which is a fabulous question, Ruth. I think in these instances, this is where there's lots of ways that a survivor could take or a victim could take the survey. So this might be one where you do it on a tablet in your office, or you offer them to do it on one of your devices instead of on their personal device. You also can ask someone just, how do you want me to send this to you? I can text it to you. Do you want to open a private tab? If there are some of those concerns, I think it's just strategizing with them and offering an array of options and giving the victim a choice on how they want to participate, navigating their safety as well as they can.
Well, and then just to add to the initial screens of the survey itself, don't have any kind of information that would identify the subject matter or the topic. It's not branded in any way, shape, or form. We've specifically kept it really plain and generic. So if somebody just like opened up that tab, now if they clicked through, they could still see the nature of the questions. But if they just wanted to look at the initial screen, there would be nothing there that would reveal anything about what the survey was. All right, so I think we have a couple minutes. Do you want to do a quick demonstration, Jacqueline?
Yeah, let me pull it up real quick. Okay.
We'll see if this works.
Yes,
Testing the limits of technology today.
always do. So this is the landing page of Improve. This is our test site. So this isn't actually where you would go if you're looking at the URL, which I know some folks squinted to see, but we use our test site for demonstrations. The landing page just kind of has some initial information about what to do and a place to register or log in to create your tool. So there's a variety of things that are accessible to folks without logging in. So that includes some resources and information about Improve and some basics, FAQs and about us type of things. We're gonna navigate to one of those real quick, which is our modules and measures. So we kind of alluded to this pre-made decision thing. This is one of those pre-made decisions. Oh, we're testing limits of technology and now it's slow. And basically we have a set of modules, which are a coupling of outcomes together that a program may seek to address. And you choose one of these base modules, base surveys, and you can build off of them from there. So this little carousel gives you some ideas of different types of ones. I'm going to hop over to one that we see a lot of law enforcement agencies settling into, which is crisis intervention and referral. And so there's some questions around how to stay safe physically, rights, knowledge of their rights of a person impacted by crime or abuse, understanding criminal justice processes and options. So there's a whole host of different ones. You can click down and see more about the actual question wording. And we do have surveys that adults can complete, as well as proxy surveys, which is for folks who are under the age of 18 at this point, and are someone who has a disability and isn't able to answer on their own behalf. We have an option for a proxy survey for those folks. So that's kind of a place where you can explore a lot of different options. That feels overwhelming to you. We also have a tool called the Module Selection Wizard, which leads you through a set of questions. You get started and you make a decision on what's the greatest priority for my program. And based off of how I click, a couple other options appear and it'll give you 2 survey options like this, maybe this. So all of this to say, you've got a lot to explore. And then eventually you'll sign in to an account. Now, no one judge me. This is our test account and it's a weird email, fly@biscuit.com. There's no judgment in the room. I can't see you, so I'm going to assume that there's not. So I sign in and then I have access to the larger, all the pop-ups, the platform itself. So here you'll see I already have 2 surveys designed. These surveys, if I click here, another pop-up opens. This is the link to the full survey. And as Lynn mentioned, this is what folks will see about sharing about their service experience. They answer, yes, I agree to take the survey. I'm replying for myself. They hit next, and then the questions will populate and they'll click through and answer, and then they'll hit submit and it's automatically transmitted to the platform. There's also that quality only option that we talked about earlier and the demographics only. So that's kind of the platform at its landing page, but I can show you, let's see how easy it is to make a tool, because I know that can always be a concern for folks. So if I go over to Improve Resources, create tool, or I can just click create new tool. It's going to open up to where I see those different names that we saw when we were exploring different module types. If I toggle one over, you'll see here that these are the core questions. So these are ones that you can't remove. We did this for the very reason that someone had asked in the audience about benchmarking. This way, there are shared outcomes among similar types of agencies. So you're able to then look at how do I compare to others who are also trying to achieve the same types of outcomes that I'm hoping to target. So these are those core outcome and quality measures here. You can see Fly is the name of my agency. So the information I got from Fly has helped me better plan for my safety. And then down here is a whole menu of different optional outcome and quality questions that I could add to customize my survey. So let's say I also want to say working with Fly has helped me feel safer. I'm adding one optional outcome. And then I want to add, I felt included in the decisions about the services I received. And maybe let's look at these 2. Staff understood what I was going through. So now I'm going to create my tool. I can review it here. And it's awesome because I can also print it out and share it with staff. Let's say I want to have a conversation with folks before I actually make this tool. I can print this out and then have a dialogue with folks. Maybe I actually have some people in my community that I want to get feedback on. Do these seem like the right measures for us to be asking folks about? You can do that before you actually create the tool. But let's say I'm ready to roll. I create my tool, I say see it, and now I have my crisis intervention referral and services tool here, and I'm ready to start sharing these links with folks in a variety of different ways. I can do that. If at any point you need to delete a form and its data, you can do that. You'd say you're messing around, you want to test it out for a little bit, you can always go there and get rid of things and clean them out. We will make sure you want to actually do that before you can delete anything. If you want to see your data, you can download your data here. And so if I click that, if you briefly saw, it started downloading my data. And now I have in another tab, it has opened to where I can see a file with my data. Then you can also explore your data by using the dashboard. So that's the last piece we can show you. The dashboard has drop downs for any of the types of surveys that you've created. Because we just created crisis intervention and referral, we won't have any data there. So I'm going to select a different one. Let's do medical or forensic care coordination. It'll pull through your data for a minute. You'll see here, these are those filters that you can use. You can go by victim or proxy responder, by a specific crime type, or by a variety of demographic variables. Once you do that, you'll see your data here. You can see how you're doing. So for each question, you'll have, increased knowledge of victims and survivors' rights, and you can look at those distributions. As Lynn mentioned, it will suppress if you have fewer than 3, just for that protection. As you start filtering, right, you could start to identify someone if you get too granular. So there are some protections built into this dashboard, but it allows you to explore your data, and you can also always download them. So this is something you could use for reports in the future if you needed to as well. Lynn or Amy, anything else we want to show folks on the platform?
No, I think that was good. Does anyone else have any questions, or did you want to jump in? Amy?
No, no. I think that's the exciting part for me, is just to be able to think about being able to customize it for what you need it for. And to be able to have some guidance through that, right? To where I don't have to feel like I have to become a researcher to actually help my program or my services become better, because that can feel really, really daunting to people. And so a lot of those decisions are made for you, and it just becomes really easy to, a few clicks and thoughtful conversation ahead of time, and you can get a useful tool.
And someone did ask, about the DV survivor question. If you Googled improve survey, would it come up in the search results? And, I did that. It's kind of enough of an amorphous name, but also improve doesn't show up anywhere in the survivor survey. So there's only information. The top bar talks about, hey, thanks for completing the survey. Here's what's going to happen with information if you have any issues. And then the survey goes. So there's actually not any information in that initial landing page that someone could take and Google. But that is something we'll continue to be mindful of as we consider how we edit that front end information. So thanks for raising that, Ruth.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jacqueline.
Thank you both. See ya.
All right, thank you, everybody. So just have about 25 minutes of closing remarks here. Thank you all for a great day. A lot of really important and impactful topics, and I think a lot of cross-cutting themes. I don't want to say we purposely identified all those, but I mean, even from this last piece, from the first couple sessions, I think all these things link together, and really appreciate everyone's engagement, and also online. I know, doing a hybrid event is not easy, and appreciate everyone online participating. And also, we want to hear from folks on how we could always make things better. Obviously, doing something like this doesn't come easy with this level of coordination and online and all the speakers. So really want to thank Peyton Attaway and Laura Beth O'Brien, and also Lindsay Calkin. There's a number of others involved too, but they did a great job, and they'll be obviously working hard tomorrow as well. But tomorrow we start at 10 a.m. again, and a great set of topics and speakers. So hope forward to seeing you here either in person or virtually. But thanks again to everyone who took the time to come out today. We really appreciate it. I did want to mention the slides will be available. And at some point when we get it prepared, we will have each individual panel available. So you can access those on the symposium website. So that'll be available. That'll take a little time to get all that ready. But again, thank you all. Have a great night, and hope to see you tomorrow.